The first sin that we see is found in Matthew chapter 27 and in verses 1 and 2. And I have dubbed this as a self-righteous religion. It's an attitude that's prominent that we can see in the attitude of the religious elites of Jesus' day. Notice what it says here. When morning came, the chief priest and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. They're plotting. They're scheming. How do we rid ourselves of this perfect individual? They bound him and led him away and delivered him over to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now, I want you to notice a couple of things about these religious people of Jesus' day. It is not just that they were Jewish people. They were God's people, certainly. But these are people who thought a certain way. They thought because of who they were, who their parents were, they were okay. They thought, we've been born a child of God. Friends, no one is born a child of God. It is a choice that we make today. But in Jesus' time, much as it is the same today, if you're born to religious people, you think you're born into the church. And that certainly is not okay. These are folks who kept the Old Testament to the letter of the law. These are the religious elites, as I mentioned, the chief priest and the elders of the people. They went so far beyond what God expected them to go that they would even prepare food on Friday to eat on Saturday. We could go back to look at that, and for time's sake this morning we won't. But Matthew chapter 2 is a good example, verse 23. And even to this day, it is against the law to do things like this. I remember several years ago that there was an Orthodox Jewish family in New York City. There was an apartment fire. And they determined that the apartment fire was caused by the large Jewish population would plug in their hot plates on Friday evening before 6 o'clock, before the Jewish day ends. They would plug those in because it is considered work to plug an electrical plug into an outlet. They couldn't do it on Saturday, so they would plug those hot plates in on Friday and let them run all day on Saturday. They couldn't unplug them until Sunday morning, or Saturday at 6 o'clock, I guess, in the evening when their day ends. That's beyond what God required, even in that day. Jesus was chastised for healing someone on the Sabbath. Can't you imagine taking care? Couldn't you imagine a hospital situation? Jesus said to them in Matthew chapter 3, verse 2 through 6, as they're chastising him for healing a man with a withered hand, Jesus said, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Well, friends, I'd rather do good. And when Jesus poses that question, the way he phrases it, by not doing what needed to be done, Jesus would have been by default doing evil. In Matthew 23:23, we see that the same group of people, the scribes and the Pharisees, the chief priests, they're paying tithes of the smallest things, trying to prove their self-righteousness. Herbs of the garden are mentioned here in Matthew 23:23. Sadly, today there are some very religious and yet unsaved people in the world. These people in Jesus' day, the chief priest and the elders of the Jewish people, thought that they were saved because of who they were, not because of a change of heart, not because of that God had an effect on their lives, but they believed that they were born to be saved. I want us to look at 2 Timothy, what the Apostle Paul says in 2 Timothy chapter 3. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and in verse 5. Paul tells Timothy this. He said, be cautious of these people. And he gives a list. He says, having the appearance of godliness, but denying its power, avoid such people. Do you and I fall into this category? Can we lead the life of a self-righteous religious people? These people have religion but not righteousness, culture but not Christ. There's a difference. We need religion, yes, but we need righteousness. Christ has to affect our heart. Otherwise, we are no better off than those who killed Jesus. We don't need culture, we need Jesus. The second thing I've noticed, if we go back to Matthew chapter 27, this time in verses 3 through 5, you will notice hypocrisy. Oh, there wouldn't be a hypocrite anywhere around here, would there? And certainly, I'm not one. I would never be a hypocrite. You know what a hypocrite means? It's one who acts in a play. The term hypocrite in the Greek language, we call them actors today. Hypocrite means an actor, one who acts out a part in a play. Matthew chapter 27, this time in verses 3 through 5, just a couple verses again. It says, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. And throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. Oh, Judas. You know, if there's a Bible character that really, my heart aches for Judas. Because Judas, if we look at Judas and who he was one of the 12 disciples. Handpicked by Jesus in Matthew chapter 10. He's listed there in verses 2 through 5, where the list of names of disciples is given. The word disciple, as the boys mentioned this morning in our Bible study, the word disciple means a learner. You know, Judas was a student of Jesus. He was there to learn from Jesus. But like some students, he didn't apply himself very well. But he followed Christ. For 3.5 years, he sat and listened to Jesus teach. And yet failed to make application to his own life. Judas took an active part in the ministry. Did you know that? He was a preacher of the gospel. Let's go back now. Surely there's nobody. Mark chapter 3, if you will. Let's go there for just a moment. Mark chapter 3, verse 14. There's not a lot of places in the scripture where Judas takes an active part, but many of the other apostles, disciples, are not listed as taking major active parts. A lot of times we focus on Peter, John, sometimes a little bit on James, but very little is said about many of the others. But here in Mark chapter 3 and in verse 14 it says, and he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles. Now we know from a previous list that Judas is among those, so that they might be with him and might send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, and then it goes on and gives a list here of names and stuff. And if you notice verse 19, Judas Iscariot, who was betrayed him. Judas is always listed last. He sent them out to preach. Judas was a preacher of the gospel. And yet Judas was a thief, a traitor, one who is listed throughout the scriptures as the one who betrayed him. Look at Luke chapter 6 for a moment. Here we begin to see Judas forming callous over his heart. Judas did not follow Jesus thinking, I'm going to make 30 pieces of silver. He didn't follow Jesus thinking, someday I'm going to turn him over and betray him. Judas began his discipleship as a learner of Christ. Judas began his work as a minister, preaching the gospel. Judas, however, formed a callous around his heart. Luke chapter 6 and verse 16, I want you to notice this. This is a progression. When we do something that is sinful, or when we fail to do something that is right, we form a callous. Our hands, as we talked in Bible class this morning, our hands form calluses where our fingers work constantly. Or our feet are on sharp stones. We form calluses so that we protect our nerve endings from pain. Judas began to form a callus because he liked to sin. And every time he sinned, he formed a thicker callus so he could not feel the guilt or the prick of his conscience. Luke chapter 6 and verse 16 says, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. See, Judas didn't start off that way. It says he became a traitor.